Requirements prioritization is a very important part of requirements engineering. So what we're going to do in this set of lessons is take a look at the different strategies you have available for requirements prioritization. So we'll start out first by taking a look at the reason why you prioritize requirements and the different types of requirements that exist that have to be prioritized. So prioritization simply means that you got to decide which ones you're going to include as part of the scope of an IT project and which ones you might defer until a different project or simply not in scope. It also includes deciding which requirements to do early in the project and which ones to do later. There's always the chance that maybe later on you run out of resources, budget, time, and you want to make sure that the most important requirements are addressed. So that's requirements prioritization. It's a scope decision and order of implementation type of decision that you need to make. Now, there are a lot of techniques for doing this, and I've categorized them. I've kind of built a taxonomy for that. And what we're going to do in some of the other lessons is take a look at the different types of techniques that exist and when you might want to apply them, when they might be appropriate, and when you use certain types of techniques for certain types of requirements. There is also a technique that is used often to decide which requirements to address in a project that is not so much based necessarily on importance, but rather is based on the fact that a very small number of requirements often make up the bulk of the value of an information system. And that technique is Pareto analysis, which is actually used in a lot of different other areas of economics, business, information system design, and so on, but we're going to use it specifically for deciding which requirements to address. So let's start by first looking at requirements and what the process of prioritization looks like. What we want to do as part of this module is look at the purpose of requirements prioritization, list the different types of requirements that you have to prioritize, and the different types of requirements that are often found in the elicitation phases of an information systems design project. So at the end of the day, requirements prioritization is the process of managing the relative importance and the relative urgency of different requirements. At the end of the day, you have limited resources when you build a system. And adequate prioritization ensures that the most critical requirements are addressed immediately in case time and or budget perhaps run out. The key understanding is that requirements do not all deliver the same value to the stakeholders. Requirements prioritization basically is an effort that determines which requirements should be investigated first, based on the risk associated with them, the cost to deliver them, the benefits they produce to the stakeholders, or some other factors. Could be including timelines, dependencies, resource constraints. There's a lot of other factors that influence how requirements are decided to be implemented in a systems development effort. Now, the main goals of requirements prioritization are very simple. Ensure that the project resources are focused on those requirements that yield the most benefit, mitigating the risk in developing solutions that allow the organization to actually achieve its business objectives and not perhaps build the wrong thing. And finally, drive consensus among stakeholders as to which requirements best meet business needs. Often the case when you have large numbers of stakeholders with potentially conflicting needs. Quick note that often pops up when you start prioritization is that there is a difference between a solution, a project, and a system. So often the solution is an information system, but it can often also be some other means by which the business can address its needs. Often it's a business process change, it is reorganization of the organizational structure of the business, it might be hiring talent, it might be purchasing a system. So always think of the solution as a way of solving a particular business need. Now we are focusing primarily on those solutions that involve information systems. That means a combination of people using the system or getting information from the system, processes in which a system is used, and of course the actual products or applications that are part of the system. And always keep in mind that a single information system is often comprised of a number of different products, applications, tiers, and so forth. It's not just always exactly one app or one system or one chunk of code. And it's not unusual that an information system is actually constructed over time across multiple projects. It's very unusual that a single project results in a single information system. You often have multiple projects that perhaps run sequentially or concurrently that result in an information system that itself is constructed from a number of different subsystems, subparts. The requirements management plan is the document that specifies how, when, and by whom requirements are prioritized. It's not always a project manager, it's not always a particular stakeholder, but there's often a set of processes or policies by which the information systems design team decides how, when, and by whom the requirements are prioritized. Now, requirements prioritization can happen at any time during the project, and it is not uncommon that the process is repeated several times as new requirements are discovered or as priority for requirements changes as the business changes while you're building the system. Remember that most development efforts might take 3, 6, or 12 months, perhaps even longer, to carry out, and during that time, of course, the market doesn't stand still, the business evolves, people come, people go, technologies change, so that of course means that often architecture's requirements, priorities of those requirements will evolve. Now, prioritization requires, of course, that the requirements have been stated. They don't have to have been fully analyzed, but you got to know what it is you're trying to build. And the requirements management plan defines the process that's used to prioritize the requirements and the various techniques that are used to do that as part of the process. Now, of course, that begs again the definition for a requirement, and we said this before, but a requirement is simply a feature that a product or service must have, or more formal definition that's part of the business analysis body of knowledge, and that is itself derived from the IEEE specification on software requirements. It defines a requirement as a condition or capability that is needed by a user to solve a problem or achieve an objective. Or slightly different perspective would be that a requirement is a condition or capability that must be met or possessed by a system or system component to satisfy a contract, a standard, a specification, or some other formally imposed document. And of course, scope refers to those requirements which have been selected to be addressed in a project. And remember that you might find many more requirements that might be useful or might be desired by the users, but not all of them can be included in a project because of constraints on time, money, resources, and so on. So that often results in a reduction of the scope, and scope simply means that that is exactly what you have agreed, or that is precisely what you have agreed to carry out as part of the project. Now, when you look at requirements, there's actually a lot of different types of requirements, and additionally, requirements are not the only information that you collect as part of the elicitation effort during the analysis phase or phases of a project. Now, the common analysis artifacts that you find include, of course, different types of requirements. We call them often solution requirements or stakeholder requirements. But there's also a number of other requirements too. There are non-functional requirements. There are business requirements or business needs. There are transition requirements that define how the solution ultimately will be implemented and what's required for a solution to be installed into its operational state. You're going to uncover assumptions, you're going to uncover constraints, and you're going to uncover lots of rules that govern the business. Now what I'm going to do next is I'm going to take a look at each one of these different analysis artifacts that you uncover when you go through the analysis efforts and the analysis phases of a project. So business requirement is the one that you find often at the very beginning. That's the ones you get when you talk to high-level business stakeholders, executives, managers, directors, vice presidents, and so on. Maybe clients if you're in a consulting environment. But business requirements describe the needs and the objectives of the organization and why some project has to be carried out. They describe what the business is trying to achieve and why it is important. That's discovered through enterprise analysis. Quick side note, when you talk to different people, they may use the same term like business requirement to actually mean a different type of requirement. The definitions I'm showing you here are the ones that are generally agreed upon by the business analysis body of knowledge, which is a standard that governs the requirements engineering, requirements management, business analysis world. Now, business requirements are generally expressed as statements that follow the SMART guidelines of being specific, measurable, achievable, relevant, and testable. And we generally write them as statements that include something that you can actually determine whether it's been achieved or not. So here's an example. Let's say you're building a prescription management system for a pharmacy organization, or maybe a large company or an insurance company. And one business requirement, based on observations with lots of, maybe over the years, drug interactions having caused problems with patients and, resulting in additional care and, of course, additional expense, the new prescription management system that is to be built has a business requirement, and that is to reduce incidence of adverse drug interactions by 30% within the next 12 months. So notice what is part of this. It's a goal, reducing incidence of something, drug interactions, by some measurable amount, 30%, within a particular time frame, 12 months. Now, of course, this does not tell you anything about how you might write the system, but that's not the point. The point is that this is the business need. You might be able to achieve that by a system, maybe by some kind of AI component that automatically checks drug interactions, maybe through a database of contraindications. You might be doing it through a process. You might be doing it through a checklist. You might be doing it by running every single prescription through 2 or 3 pharmacists. We're not stating here how we're going to solve this, but we're simply saying that the ultimate solution should result in that outcome, in that goal. And there are 2 more examples right here of business requirements. Remember, at the business level, it does not matter how it's achieved. What matters is that this is the goal that the business has in mind when it undertakes this project and spends the money. Now, of course, eventually you're going to talk to specific users, regulatory bodies, people using the system. They're called stakeholders. Now, the stakeholders have very specific needs. They want the solution to something very specific for them. So they're more refined, more precise, more detailed, more granular than business requirements. So an example is a physician wants to be able to write a prescription. Now, stakeholder requirements are often expressed either as use cases or as user stories. Both are common formats and both are to be discussed in separate lessons. Another example is that a physician wants to be able to check the interaction of a prescribed drug with other drugs that have been prescribed previously. Or, expresses a user story, as a physician, I want to check if the drug I am prescribing has side effects so that I can alert my patient. So stakeholders are often users, but it could also be regulatory agencies. The key is that to prescribe very specific needs of specific stakeholders. And they will eventually be broken down further into functional requirements, or precisely functional solution requirements. Very specific requirements that the solution is going to have to possess. And they're often built as narrative statements, or they're described within a use case, or they're often described in screen or report mock-ups. So there's various ways of expressing those, but they're very, very detailed. So what we've done is we've broken it down. From business, you get lots of stakeholder requirements. Stakeholder requirements are further broken down into functional solution requirements. Like, the system shall list the side effects by order of probability of occurrence, or the system shall allow the patient to select the pharmacy to which the prescription will be sent. The patient should see the pharmacies ordered in proximity to their current location. The system should only list the pharmacies that are part of the patient's insurance. Pharmacies that are not part of the patient's insurance should be flagged with a red mark. Those are all examples of functional solution requirements. Very, very detailed, but they all eventually address some stakeholder need, which of course in turn resolve some business need. Now, of course, there's also lots of non-functional requirements. Accessibility, usability, performance, response time, security, compatibility, maintainability, availability, reliability, and so on. And they're also expressed as narrative statements. And they essentially provide constraints on the solution. For example, the system shall be available from 2 a.m. through midnight, 99% of the time. Or the system shall not display any patient identifying information except the patient's name and insurance information on any printed prescription. Or the system shall list drug side effects and contraindications within 2 seconds after a drug has been selected, 90% of the time. By the way, notice that there is a frequency constraint here. It says here within 2 seconds after it's been selected 90% of the time, because there could be times where the system might be a little bit slower. It might wait on a lock from the database. It might have to communicate over a congested network to another server or some kind of a component, and maybe just for that particular instance just a little bit slow and takes 2.5 or 3 seconds. So it's often very difficult to achieve certain constraints 100% of the time. Now, of course, there might be cases where it is important 100% of the time, but if it's not, indicate how, whether you allow any kind of leeway. A little bit hard to test. You may have to test lots and lots and lots of displays of drugs eventually and see if at least 90% of them come up within 2 seconds. We also need to collect transition requirements. Those are the requirements that define how the solution gets installed, how we go from how the organization works right now to using the new solution. So this could often mean backing up old systems, running 2 systems in parallel, transferring data from the old system to the new system, training users, updating checklists, updating forms, updating training material, everything that has to do with what's required to actually get the solution that you've built deployed. They're also often called deployment requirements or implementation requirements, because you implement the solution in practice into the operational state. Here's an example. Send a memo to all physicians informing them that all prescriptions must be electronic. That is probably, again, hundreds of these types of requirements that you often have. Now, of course, you also have assumptions. Things that you assume to be true or simply assume must be true without really having either concrete proof or going any further. Like all the messages must be displayed in English, or You're assuming, of course, that patients have access to a pharmacy that accepts electronic prescriptions when you build this new system. Or they have access to a computer so they can check the prescriptions online and refill them because you no longer provide phone support. Whatever it is, basically there's certain assumptions that you're making or things that you presume need to be true in order for your solution to work. You will also discover lots of other types of constraints. Time constraints, budget constraints, technical constraints. Like this has to run on certain operating systems, on certain equipment. And then you discover rules. Now this gets a bit tricky because a lot of analysts assume that the rules are the same as requirements, but they're not. Rules are policies and guidelines by which the business operates. They're independent of any system. They're specified by the business for the business, and it doesn't matter if you're building an information system or not, they still have to be enforced. But of course, we often build information systems to automatically enforce all the business rules. In which case, of course, the fact or the requirement that they have to be enforced becomes a requirement. Like, for example, there might be a business rule in physicians' offices that will use a system that says patients may not receive any samples of medications. So if that's the case, you need to make sure that there is some way of enforcing this. Could be done through training, could be done through posting of notes on walls or bulletin boards, could be done by restricting access to the sample desk, could be done by not allowing any pharmacy or any pharmaceutical company to drop off any samples. That's an example of a business rule. So those are the different types of requirements that we need to eventually prioritize. So we're going to think about now is different types of strategies for prioritizing requirements. Now, of course, the reason why we prioritize is very simple. At the end of the day, we have limited resources. Limited staff, limited money, time, and certain constraints on quality. So prioritization is essentially nothing more than a way of dealing with the economics or the reality of project management. Now, prioritization always happens in a collaborative effort, in a collaborative manner. It's with the stakeholders, the customers, the product owners, the people who pay you, project sponsors, users, and so on. And it's done early. As soon as you uncover requirements, you want to prioritize. Now, a common trap is to let the customers, users, or stakeholders simply decide which requirements should be implemented. And unfortunately, what happens in practice often is that customers, stakeholders, users will simply say, well, everything's important. Everything's critical. Don't leave anything out. And of course, that is not feasible because you have limited time and budget. So you, a business analyst, an information analyst, a requirements engineer, has to guide the customer through the prioritization process. And you often have to challenge the customer, the user. You have to ask, well, you want that requirement, great, but what's the consequence if this requirement's omitted? What if we don't get to it? What would happen in your business? Do you have an alternative process or another system that maybe could compensate? Or has that requirement already implemented just in case we don't get to it? Ask, why can't we just simply wait? What happens if it doesn't get done in the first release? What happens if it happens next year? Do we run into any potential business risk? Do we run afoul of regulations if we don't implement some particular requirement? But bottom line is, if we leave it out, what would happen? So that basically means that effective prioritization is a collaborative effort between stakeholders and the business analyst. And the business analyst or requirements analyst should challenge the stakeholders to ensure that requirements are truly needed and if and whether workarounds are available. There are different types of requirements, constraints, assumptions that all have to be prioritized. And remember that business rules are not prioritized because they're not requirements. They're the policies by which the business operates. Although you may ultimately decide that you may not necessarily enforce all the business rules through a system, but that there might be manual processes or manual mechanisms that are used to enforce certain policies or rules.